please welcome Charles C.W. Cooke and the FCC Chairman, Ajit Pai.
All right, well, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, great to be with you. Keep it clean.
I will.
Yeah.
Maybe we can start by asking a basic question. You're chairman of the FCC. What is the FCC? What does it do?
So the Federal Communications Commission is the nation's premier communications regulation agency. We were created 85 years ago in 1934. I see our mission essentially as enabling Americans around the country to be able to benefit from communications technologies, whether it's the more traditional ones like radio and TV and telephone, or the more modern ones, satellite, internet, and wireless. And so matching the aspirations of the American consumer with the technological innovations that are on tap. That's what I see our core mission as being.
Okay, and what was the mission in 1934? Has it changed, or is it pretty much the same?
It has changed a little bit since 1934. Back then, we were created essentially to regulate the airwaves, the broadcast TV and radio airwaves, the spectrum that was being used. In addition, regulating Ma Bell, AT&T, the telephone monopoly. And so there's a whole list of regulations that Congress charged the agency with imposing back in 1934. But it's certainly changed quite a bit over then. As technology has advanced, the agency's mission has changed as well. And that's one of the big challenges of this job, frankly, is fitting the square peg of regulation into the round hole of technological innovation.
Oh, well, which brings up a related question, which is what should it do? There is a debate, isn't there, over what the FCC should be doing.
Yeah.
So in your view, what should it be doing and what shouldn't it be doing?
I mean, I think in our view, we should be guided by a few basic principles. I mean, first and foremost, to have a strong belief in the power of the free market. I mean, I think that history generally, but our experience in this space particularly, demonstrates that markets are far better positioned to drive innovation and investment than government regulation. I mean, I think that ultimately the entrepreneurship, the initiative that is shown by private individuals and companies has delivered far greater benefits for American consumers than all-knowing bureaucrats here in Washington. And I don't take any offense to that myself. But I think ultimately that's one of the things we have to respect. The second thing is the rule of law. The agency can't simply make it up as it goes along. We are ultimately bound by the laws that Congress passes and the President signs. And that Communications Act is essentially our founding document. We have to stay true to the words of that. And even if something might be a good idea as a matter of policy, nonetheless, we can't simply say, okay, put our finger in the wind and say this is what we're going to do. We have to have a statutory mandate. The other piece of it, which is becoming increasingly important, especially nowadays, is a respect for the basic principles of economics and physics. All kinds of wild-eyed ideas might sound good in theory, but when you run it through the rigor of economic analysis and you realize, well, the costs are going to greatly outweigh the benefits, that would suggest it's a bad thing. Same thing with physics. We might mandate all kinds of great things in theory, but if they don't work in the real world, that's a problem. And so we've tried to incorporate over the last 2 years under my leadership a greater respect for those basic principles. And I think that's part of the reason why our agenda has been much more successful in terms of driving what I call digital opportunity for all Americans.
All right, so at the risk of talking you out of your job, explain to me how likely it is that the FCC will eventually become unnecessary. And what I mean by that is, if you go back to 1934, radio is one of the main means by which people communicate. Now, you only have a limited bandwidth for radio, right? So the FCC is there so that it can regulate that spectrum, because if everyone starts a radio station, you'll just get static. The same thing is true of television. But now we move data in different ways. We have TCP/IP is the Ethernet, which is the underpinning of the internet. We have satellites. We have cable over coax, which is not regulated, I believe, by the FCC.
Right.
Are we going to reach a point eventually at which there is no such thing as a limited bandwidth spectrum and we don't need an FCC to regulate it? Or is it the case that there are always challenges, both technologically and otherwise, that you'll be asked to address?
I think that could well happen someday, hopefully not until my term is over, for self-interested reasons, of course. But no, I do think that the marketplace has changed dramatically. I mean, just with respect to spectrum, for example, the AM radio band occupies about 1 megahertz of spectrum total. Just to give you context, over the next 18 months, the FCC is going to be auctioning off over 5,000 megahertz of spectrum for 5G, the next generation of wireless connectivity. So a huge influx of supply, a great increase in competition, much more innovation than we ever thought was possible. So it could well be that in time, there will be private mechanisms to sort out some of these things. But I do think there will continue to be a role for the FCC in certain ways. For example, some of the authorizations we give in order for companies abroad to be able to enter the US market and things like that might continue to be important. And so that's until Congress changes the law, at least, we're going to continue to administer some of those important statutory functions.
Okay, so one of the questions that has come up before you is net neutrality.
Ah, I hear it, yes.
You may have heard of it. What is net neutrality, and why are some people so upset at the decision that you took as to essentially threaten your life? What was that about?
Yeah, I'm sometimes interested to hear whenever people approach me, we're really upset with what you did on net neutrality. I'll ask them, well, what is it? I'm like, well, I get this sort of puzzled look. Well, you know, it's about, well, yeah. We need something more concrete here. So in my view, at least, I mean, net neutrality, first and foremost, is a very seductive marketing slogan. I mean, who could be against neutrality, of course? But ultimately what it means is government regulation of the internet. It means the federal government putting its finger on the scale in favor of a particular sector of the industry and saying, we know best how to direct investment, how to manage networks and the like. And in my view, at least, the internet is the greatest free market innovation in history. And to borrow from a recent public official, government didn't build that, someone else made that happen for the most part, the internet economy that we have today. And so in our view, that's because in parts, and this is going to sound unusual for a Republican chairman, I give credit to the Clinton administration because back in 1996, they believed and they enmeshed in federal law with the agreement of a Republican Congress that the internet should be, quote, unfettered by federal and state regulation. And you can look it up. It's 47 US Code 230 for those geeks out there who are second guessing about this. And so that next 20 years, from 1996 until 2015, we had this light touch, market-based approach to the internet. And look at what happened. We saw $1.5 trillion in network investment. We saw small, scrappy startups become global giants like Facebook and Amazon and Netflix and Google. We saw consumers benefiting from this innovation in ways that were unthinkable a generation ago. I mean, we live in the day-to-day, so we find it hard to remember. But 20 years ago, the internet meant getting AOL CD-ROMs in the mail, hearing that whir of the modem when you were trying to dial up. I mean, it was just, it's incredible how much innovation we've seen over the past 20 years. And I would argue it's not because of government, it's because we made the decision not to heavily regulate the internet like a slow-moving utility, like Amtrak, or like your electric company, or like the DMV. And so in my view, the 2015 decision to impose these so-called net neutrality regulations, it was a solution in search of a problem. The internet wasn't broken when the previous administration decided to fix it. And the results of the fix turned out to be negative. I mean, infrastructure investment for the first time outside of a recession declined. We saw more and more companies hiring lawyers and accountants instead of investing in their networks. And ultimately, we saw countries around the world thinking, well, you know, if America's getting in on the game, maybe we should start thinking about heavy-handed regulations as well. And so that's part of the reason why I think this entire enterprise was misguided. Now, as to the question of why people are upset, I'll be candid, I think it's because a lot of people saw political advantage in fomenting a lot of fear. And so you saw all of these false fears, and we've documented some of them. We saw a broadcast on December 14th of 2017, for example, when we made our decision. This is the end of the internet as we know it. You're going to have to pay $5 per tweet. Our internet is going to look like Portugal's, or my favorite, which was tweeted out by the Senate Democratic Caucus, the internet will load one word at a time, which is what they said in a tweet. Last time I checked, you can still hate tweet your favorite FCC chairman at speed without any problem. And so, in our view at least, this entire thing was just, it's generated a lot of heat because some people saw political advantage in it. And the results of our decision now are becoming increasingly clear. A report that came out in December, for example, showed that speeds for the internet increased from December 2017, when we made our decision, to December of 2018 by over 35%. We're seeing infrastructure investment going up. We're hearing about new companies investing in this infrastructure and new companies entering the space. And so, in our view at least, this free market approach is proven to be the right one, and notwithstanding what some grandstanding politicians or Beltway special interests might want to say.
The grandstanding politicians just passed a bill through the House, I believe, that would overturn your decision. And if it were to go through the Senate and be signed by the president, that would be American law. If that happens, what are the worst case scenario? Because it was a lot of political noise, I agree, but there were also a lot of major corporations who backed this idea of keeping net neutrality. Was that regulatory capture? Do they want to stop smaller businesses from coming in? What was driving that?
I think some of them want to simply regulate their rivals. They've achieved dramatic scale in Silicon Valley. They are some of the biggest companies in the entire world. And they thought, well, let's cement a regulatory advantage for ourselves by forcing on our rivals, the people who build and operate these networks, heavy-handed regulations. And so the notion that Paladin Wireless in Royston, Georgia has market power vis-a-vis Google is absurd on its face, but nonetheless, that's exactly what the previous administration decided to do. Preemptively treat the thousands of internet service providers across the United States, the big ones we all know, but even the small ones that very few people have heard of, as preemptive monopolists, and to slap 1930s regulations on them. And we talked about the 1934 Communications Act. The internet regulations imposed by the previous administration are based directly on those 1934 laws that were designed during the Roosevelt administration to handle Ma Bell, the telephone monopoly. That is exactly the wrong type of approach, we think, to this dynamic framework of the internet.
Okay, so last question on net neutrality. Suppose that the nightmare scenario did come to fruition. So rather than the last year of innovation that you've seen, you start to see exactly the nightmare scenario play out. And all of the ISPs, essentially as a cartel, they do start charging different subscription models. So, you know, they probably make an exception for you so that they can send insults your way really quickly. But you know, they start charging for access to Twitter, they start charging for access to Netflix. They're really very clearly treating each traffic category as discrete. And people say, hey, I hate this, I much prefer the internet.
Right.
At that point, is there a role for the FCC to come in and regulate, or is your view that the market would bring in new players who, noticing that people were so upset by the status quo, would seek to change it?
So a few different points. First and foremost, we did not see that type of behavior in the 20 years when we had these market-based regulations. We don't see them today. Point number two, we have firm transparency regulations at the FCC, so every single internet service provider has to disclose all kinds of business practices and network management practices to us and the American public. So we would know that immediately. There'd be a tremendous amount of scrutiny from us, from the press, from others. Number three, it's also backed up by vigorous enforcement from the Federal Trade Commission. The Federal Trade Commission has jurisdiction over any unfair or deceptive trade practice or any unfair method of competition. And because of a memorandum of understanding between our two agencies, the FTC also stands willing and able to enforce the law in that regard. I would point out number three, however, that some of these hypotheticals are hypocritical when it comes from certain companies that engage in these same practices themselves. For example, I don't know if those of you, let's put this hypothetical out there. What if I were to tell you right now that there's a very big corporation that delivers a service by charging publishers, people like National Review, a certain amount of money. And what they say is, if you pay us this money, we will deliver this content onto your mobile phones more quickly. Well, that service exists today. It's done by Google, and it's called Accelerated Mobile Pages. I mean, it's literally in the name of the product. We will deliver this content faster if the publishers pay us a fee. Now, where are the net neutrality advocates about this? They're nowhere to be found, and I suspect it's because they don't want to focus on Silicon Valley. They want to focus on a certain aspect of the industry. But if they're being intellectually honest, they should have an answer as to why that is pro-competitive. I could come up with ideas either way, but I'm simply saying that we need to have a level regulatory playing field here. Let's be intellectually honest and figure out what that framework should be. In my view, it's the free market framework, not the Washington knows best framework that will ultimately deliver an internet that works as quickly as your DMV, that runs as reliably as Amtrak, and ultimately is as popular as your post office.
So what role is there for government in making sure that people in rural communities, people who live in the middle of nowhere, have access to the internet?
This is where I think the American public's attention should be and is drawn. I mean, when I've traveled around the United States, and I've been now to 44 states and the territories of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, I have yet to hear anyone say, Yeah, we really believe our top idea is Title II versus Title I regulation of the internet. It's that we want internet access, period. We want more competition. And this is what we are charged with doing. Our top mission is closing that digital divide. And I say that not just professionally, but personally. I grew up in a small town in rural Kansas that predominantly is on the wrong side of the digital divide. And so we see our role as trying to get the building blocks of internet infrastructure into those parts of the country. Modernizing our regulations, for example, to make it easier for providers to build this infrastructure, whether it is wireless towers or the fiber that goes under the ground, or getting more spectrum out there for certain wireless companies to use to provide access to rural areas. I mean, that is an area where I would think all of us could come together, and that's part of the reason why I regret that this net neutrality discussion has chewed up so much attention here in Washington. We need to have a sense of mission in this country about connecting every American. It's a matter of national competitiveness as well as empowering the families and communities around this country. But unfortunately, we've been sidetracked somewhat.
So what is 5G? It's part of this movement to increase and upgrade our infrastructure. What is 5G and how does it relate to the net neutrality question?
So 5G is the next generation in wireless connectivity. Most people are familiar with 4G, for example. 5G promises a transformational wireless experience. It could be 100 times faster than 4G, if not more than that. The latency, which is the gap in time that it takes when you ping the network and the time the network gets back to you, that latency will be 1/100th perhaps of what it is today. And we're talking about huge increases in bandwidth, gigabit speed. So for example, you could seamlessly stream 4K, even 8K video on your mobile phone as if you were sitting at home on your desktop. And so we think that 5G is a tremendous opportunity for wireless innovation. The other reason why it's important, to me at least, is because it demonstrates another opportunity for the United States to show leadership. Other countries, China in particular, saw the success the United States had with 4G, not just in delivering the networks, but the entire app economy that rides on top of those networks. They want to seize the advantage for themselves. That's part of the reason why last fall I introduced what I call the 5G Fast Plan, facilitating America's superiority in 5G technologies, getting more spectrum into the marketplace, making it easier to deploy wireless infrastructure of the future, and modernizing our rules to promote more fiber deployment. Those are the three key parts of the 5G Fast Plan, and we're executing on all three, and as a result, America is in the lead. But we think that there's all kinds of innovation we can't even imagine right now. The things that we do imagine, telemedicine and precision agriculture, online education, and all kinds of things like that, but the future could be dramatic. I mean, using virtual reality, for example, to train medical students on doing robotic surgery, managing ports remotely using some of these 5G applications. I mean, there are all kinds of things that are on tap if we get the building blocks in place, and that's exactly what we're doing.
And how did China do that? Was that government-led, or did they open up the space to free enterprise?
This is one of the big challenges that we have. So China, of course, as you might be aware, doesn't observe all of the democratic niceties that we do. And so if Beijing decides we shall make it the national policy to succeed in 5G, essentially they just wipe they organize the entire regulatory structure towards making that happen. And they directly subsidize some of their own companies and the like. And so part of the issue we have is that in the United States, we have federal and state and local, and in some cases, tribal regulatory review, whereas in China, it's just a seamless regulatory apparatus. And so one of the things we've been trying to do is to speed up that process, to streamline our governmental approval process in order to promote 5G entrepreneurship on our shores instead of that talent going abroad.
There are people in America who suffer from what is best described as China envy. Mm-hmm. Tom Friedman wants to be China for a day, which essentially means wants to remove all of the limitations on government and get rid of the distinctions you just outlined. So there would be no difference between the federal and the state. There'd be nobody who could get in the way. That obviously is abhorrent to most of us in this room. We like the checks and balances, but what about the argument that those checks and balances, although very useful politically and of course constitutionally necessary, are going in the long run to leave America at a disadvantage, are going to leave us behind?
I do think that some of the different layers of regulatory review will end up stalling investment. I mean, for example, if you are a small wireless company and you're looking to compete against the bigger companies in 5G, and you're thinking about how do we deploy a 5G network at scale, the 5G networks of the future are going to look very different from the 4G networks. Instead of intermittently dispersed 200-foot cell towers, we're going to see hundreds, if not thousands, of small cells, very small infrastructure, no bigger than a pizza box, relatively inconspicuous, but you have to have a lot more of them. And if you're a small company and you're trying to figure out how to do this, if you have to get permission from the FCC or some other federal entity, the state government, the local government, and any one of the 572 federally recognized Indian tribes and other organizations, it's going to be very difficult to do that. And so our position has been, let's streamline the process to make sure that government's legitimate interest in making sure that these things meet the public interest don't end up impeding investment. That is what we've seen in some cases, that there are exorbitant fees that are charged by local governments simply because they can. And that's ultimately going to lead America on a macro level to lag behind in terms of 5G infrastructure.
And is China at risk the other way around, that they don't have enough innovation, or is their government as good at that as American companies are?
I continue to believe that the innovative spirit that's here in the United States is the strongest in the world, but nonetheless, there's no question that China, as I said, has made it a major priority to lead in 5G, and part of that involves innovation, not just in 5G, but some of the related technologies that will interact with 5G. For example, artificial intelligence and machine learning. They're pouring a huge amount of investment and innovation into that. And you see some of the results with some of how they're trying to think about using facial recognition technology in order to control some of their own subjects. Same thing with other technologies like blockchain and quantum computing and the like. And I think that's part of the reason why we need to make sure that we prioritize on a national level investment and innovation in emerging technologies. We need to empower our private sector to compete, to innovate, and ultimately to enable us to lead.
So at the risk of asking you, both either directly or indirectly, to criticize your colleagues, suppose that we have a turnover in leadership, or the balance changes within the Commission. What should the audience be worried about? What's the one thing they should be worried about happening?
I would hope that with respect to this issue, at least, we would share an interest in preserving U.S. leadership in 5G. That is, as I said, a national priority, not a political priority. And one of the things I would worry about is whether or not anyone who with a more regulatory bent will end up seeing the market as something to be regulated as opposed to something to be encouraged. I mean, to borrow from Shakespeare, hell hath no fury like a regulator bored. And the more, so some people see this innovative spirit as something to be tamed as opposed to something to be encouraged. And it's all too tempting, I think, for some people to say, look, we are not going to trust the market with the backstop of Federal Trade Commission enforcement. We want to preemptively declare the entire marketplace broken and empower government to deliver solutions for the American people. History demonstrates why that has been folly, but I fear that it's a lesson we are constantly having to learn, especially in the regulatory space.
All right, well, so here's a question. Here's a question that relates to one I asked earlier, although this is far more pointed and I think probably better. It says, what would the FCC do if ISPs began blocking content from right-leaning groups, or it wasn't precluded by their customer agreements? You get viewpoint discrimination by an ISP, what happens?
The same thing, the transparency rule would kick in, and if they hadn't disclosed these network management and business practices, that would potentially be an FCC violation. The same thing with blocking access to lawful content. The Federal Trade Commission would evaluate that under its well-established framework under Section 5 of the Federal Trade Commission Act. So there too.
Could you get an ISP that said, we are the left-leaning ISP, and we don't hide it, we just don't let anyone read National Review on our ISP, and that's what we do?
So again, that doesn't happen in the marketplace today, but if it did happen, that is something that would be evaluated under the framework I just outlined. Moreover, I would point out that whoever asked the question should be far more concerned about other players in the internet economy that do in fact decide what you see, and more importantly, what you don't. Those players are entirely unregulated, and I think that's part of the reason why last fall I published a blog in which I said we need to have a candid conversation about transparency. Where is the transparency for some of these tech giants that don't have to disclose how they're deciding what content people see and what they don't? We have no idea right now, and that's part of the reason why you see a bipartisan upswell in Congress right now about how to think about these issues, is because there's simply no regulation at all, and there's a vacuum right now.
Should there be? I mean, what should we do if Google starts saying it's going to prioritize, Rachel Maddow above anyone else when you look up politics?
That's a decision ultimately for Congress and the Federal Trade Commission to make. I am a free marketer by instinct. I'll simply point out that it's hypocritical for some of the same tech giants that have foisted these heavy-handed regulations on others to now be complaining about the prospect of heavy-handed regulation of a similar kind being imposed on themselves.
Another question. Several states have filed legislation to place net neutrality in state law. If enough states pass legislation on this topic, will the FCC reconsider this issue either to preempt state law or come up with a different proposal on packet equality? First, before you answer that, is that legal for states to be regulating what is a federal concern? Is this a gray area? How does that work?
It depends on the nature of the state legislation. Generally speaking anyway, we view the internet as inherently an interstate activity. Even though we're sitting next to each other, if you were to email me right now, if you were to tweet at me, that would be an internet communication that most likely would traverse state boundaries. And it follows from that, under the Constitution and the laws of the United States, that it can only be regulated on the federal level. The FCC only can set the regulatory policy for the country. And so to the extent that a state is seeking to supplant that federal regulatory decision, that state law would be preempted. And again, the particulars matter in terms of the state legislation in question, but generally speaking, we believe there should be a consistent level of federal regulation as opposed to a patchwork of state regulations that are pursued. We see a similar dynamic, by the way, with respect to privacy. Now, certain states are passing privacy laws. California, for example, passed a privacy law that is fairly strong. And now we see some of the same companies that urged net neutrality regulations to be adopted on the state level now coming to Washington saying, well, we need a federal privacy law because we need to preempt all of the states that might seek to regulate in this area. And so here too, under the well-established precedent of goose versus gander, I think some of them are seeing the danger of allowing states to patchwork regulate some of these things that are more properly regulated on the federal level.
The question, what does the FCC have to do with Huawei?
I'm sorry?
I don't know. Huawei?
Oh, Huawei.
Huawei.
Yes.
I've only ever read that. You know when you've done that? When I was at school, I had to give this prize for reading to somebody, and I had read Harry Potter, but I'd never heard it out loud, and I said in front of the whole school that her favorite character was Hermione, and not Hermione. And I've managed since that point to avoid doing it again until right now, so...
Well, we could do a digression on the lack of classics education, Greek names in particular,
exactly.
in the English school system, but we will leave that for another time. No, I mean, one of the things that the FCC is concerned about is the integrity of our supply chain. As these networks become ever more complex, they rely on equipment and products that come from companies that may be located abroad. So that's why last year I proposed barring the use of federal funds that come from the FCC from being spent on equipment or services that come from a company or from a country that have been determined by the United States government to pose a national security threat. That's an ongoing proceeding that we are evaluating. And in addition, the government, generally speaking, has expressed concern about certain companies that may be subjected to intelligence requirements domestically in terms of, for example, a national intelligence law that in China requires, quote, any individual or entity, unquote, from complying with a request for cooperation from the intelligence services. And that's one of the things that the United States government has expressed some concern about.
I think this will probably have to be the last question given the time, but what is the FCC's role in defining and distinguishing sponsorship and ad messaging versus free speech?
So generally speaking, we do have some jurisdiction over what's called sponsorship identification when it comes to broadcast TV and the like. But when it comes to the internet, we certainly don't. And with respect to this free speech generally, I mean, I am somewhat of a First Amendment absolutist. I do believe the last thing we want is the government being a gatekeeper, deciding who can speak and who can't, who shall be allowed to speak on certain terms and who can't. And generally speaking, that has infused the way I've done the job over the last 2 years. I think it's very tempting for those to say, well, okay, why shouldn't the federal government police what is said on this particular website? But once you go down that road, I think history has shown that it's a very dangerous path. And I think one of the things that distinguishes American culture from virtually every other country in the world is that we've had not just the cold guarantee of the First Amendment and the parchment of the Constitution, but this culture of free speech that allows and encourages people to speak online. And to me, at least, the internet is one of the great public squares of our era. And one of the things I fear, and I've spoken about this for many years, going back into the previous administration, is that many people seem less likely than ever to defend that saying misattributed to Voltaire, that I might disagree with what you say, but I will fight to the death for your right to say it. That's becoming a scarce value in today's democracy, and that is a very worrying sign for me as a citizen.
So a question I've long had, and we have to be quick as you can see the clock. When television is broadcast over the air, or radio is broadcast over the air within FCC-regulated bandwidth, the FCC has some rules in place. But, for example, cable doesn't, and nor has the internet. But why do those rules not apply to internet traffic broadcast over spectrum that is regulated. You said you're going to be auctioning off 5G bandwidth. Why don't those rules attach to that?
The short answer would be that Congress hasn't given the FCC jurisdiction over those other forms of communication. So there's a specific statute that directs the FCC to look into the broadcast indecency, profanity, and obscenity rules, but there isn't a similar statute that applies to other media. And so that's one of the reasons why there is that distinction between the two.
Which is a good thing, I think.
We hear all the time
You're
from
not
people
allowed
on
to
both
say.
sides, so I will stay mum on that
I
one.
think it's a good thing. Well, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Ajit Pai.
Oh, thank you. Pleasure. That was great. Thanks so much. I really enjoyed it.